Hello, everybody, and welcome to 30 Minute Thrive, your go-to podcast for anything and everything HR, powered by MRA, the Management Association. Looking to stay on top of the ever-changing world of HR? MRA has got you covered. We'll be the first to tell you what's hot and what's not. I'm your host, Sophie Voller, and we are so glad you're here. Now it's time to thrive. Hello, everybody, and welcome to MRA's 30 Minute Thrive podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about improving employee relations and hear from an HR expert advisor on how to foster better relationships between employees and management, and ultimately create a more positive and productive workforce. So Amy Wittenberger is one of MRA's HR advisors, so she's on our 24/7 HR hotline, answering any HR questions you may have. So Amy, welcome back. I'm glad you're on the podcast again.
Thank you. It's fun. I enjoy it.
Good. Well, employee relations is such a big topic, and we only have 30 minutes, unfortunately, in the episode. So let's kind of break this down a little bit and just kind of give us an overview of what employee relations is and what can be done about it.
Sure. Sounds like fun. When I think of employee relations and being on the hotline, it's probably my favorite call.
Yes.
Because you really get to work with the HR in terms of discussing an issue that may or may not be easy. And working through, what is the best way for them to handle it. Mm-hmm. I give them a lot of respect because most of the time they're calling, knowing that the answer is, but they just want to walk through it with someone to make sure that they're thinking about all the things that they need to. Mm-hmm. It's really where we can help coach and brainstorm ideas. Maybe even it's even training the trainer, coaching them how to talk with the supervisor regarding an issue. And this is where we really get to help HR thrive.
Yeah.
In terms of what's going on. When I think of employee relation issues, it's running the gamut between investigations. It could be employee complaints about how they're working with a fellow colleague, or maybe with their supervisor. It could be complaints about bullying, offensive behavior, performance, attendance, things going on with terminations. Sometimes managers come to us and say, we don't think this employee is working out or is a good fit because they're, toxic or rabble-rouser, gossiping, things like that, all really hard. And then there's the cell phones. They're everywhere these days. So we get our share of calls in terms of, what do I do with an employee that is texting about another employee, using the phone too much, maybe using it for social media and talking about employees or the company. So it's pretty broad based in terms of the issues we work through. Mm-hmm. But again, it is my favorite call because I really get to work with them and answer questions and help them think through the best solution.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I like the more positive side you were talking about. We can get into the investigations and conflict resolution and stuff like that in another episode. But let's start out by kind of defining what would good employee relations look like.
Sure. When I think of a story when I used to teach at Cardinal Stretch, and I called it the HR triangle. And it was a trick question because I used to say, is HR the advocate for an employee or a manager? Mm-hmm. And it's a trick question because it's an and. So they're the advocate for the employee and the manager as well as the company. Mm-hmm. And that's when we think about the broad picture of employee relations. Mm-hmm. It's everyone's role to really work on maintaining a proactive environment. So HR can help support employees do that and managers do that, as well as help drive some of those communications that can be more proactive. And that's when employee relations works best is when it's positive and proactive, which then it gets to avoiding some of the negative situations. Yeah. So I like to say an ounce of prevention is certainly worth a pound of cure in terms of working through positive communications.
Yeah, for sure. Any other practical strategies that employers can implement to improve employee relations, or how can an HR really support this in an organization?
Yeah, I think of 3 areas probably where it's best to focus. Mm-hmm. The very first thing that comes to mind, is working on onboarding. Yeah. Then certainly like an over communication plan with an open door policy. And then I think because so much happens between the manager and the employee, I think it's really important for us to provide training for our managers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I think of onboarding, I think of that's where employee relationship begins between employer and employee. So I think anytime you can spend more time up front So during the onboarding, having really good, rich conversations in terms of, what is it that you expect from employees? What expectations do you have for behaviors? What behaviors do you not want to see in the environment? And I think it's important not to assume that these employees know this. I think you need to be really intentional in terms of what you want to see in employees and guide them that way. Talk to them about what it means to build trust in an environment, how to work respectfully with each other, how to empathize with each other, getting to know them, building relationships with employees, and then tell them what you don't want to see in terms of, what is offensive behavior, what is gossiping, and why doesn't it work? Because it, breaks down trust and hurts people. So I think those, the more you have those up front, people understand better. Then if you move into, after they're employed for a while, I think whatever HR leadership can do to develop an overall strategy for working through positive communications. Yeah. So what kind of strategies can we put in to be proactive? What can we do to help our managers in terms of having an open door policy? And that isn't about, bring everything you want to my door,
right?
But teach them what it means, which is if you're going to come to my door, let's talk about where you can be part of the solution.
Yeah.
Come with ideas and what you don't like and what it would look like if it was fixed.
Absolutely.
So just maintaining those conversations.
Yeah.
And then working with the managers.
Yeah.
So much happens between a manager and the employee. It's really supporting those managers on how to have good communications and what that means for them in terms of, setting outcomes, making sure employees understand those outcomes, allowing questions, building rapport, checking in with them, all those things that you can do to be proactive about the relationship.
I love that. That was all great advice. I like the onboarding examples of giving your new employees those examples, because some of them may not even know what I don't know what they mean. And So earlier you mentioned that this is about maintaining positive relationships. So what are some strategies that HR and managers can use to build relationships?
So I think some of the things that we can focus on is really those terms I said earlier, which is working on trust. So what does it mean, to trust each other when I'm working together with an employee? It's teaching them how to have those conflict resolution conversations, understanding people's stories. So, get to know your workers and where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And then the same thing with managers. But then I think leaders really need to do some broader things, which is make sure employees understand that their contribution is important and that we should seek their feedback and let them know that what they're sharing with us is important for us to understand, kind of like the pulse of what's going on in the environment.
Yeah, that's great advice. Let's switch gears a little bit now and return to the relationships fundamentals. So let's talk a little bit about how we can prevent or lessen these employee relation issues may arise.
So I think another story kind of comes to mind only because, again, I think much of what happens is between the manager and the employee.
Yeah.
They're managing them every day. And I think, communications is hard to get right. Getting work done through employees is hard to do. So I think, again, working through managers. But I think of many times when I've worked with supervisors or managers that have come to me about an employee, either it's time to, let them go or work through a performance improvement plan. You always kind of want to step back. And I would always say, when you're pointing your finger at an employee, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you, supervisor. And I try to get them to realize, what has been the proactive things you've done? Have you been proactive in the relationship? So I would ask them questions like, have you set expectations with them? And did you give them time to think about what that means? And ask questions on how to achieve those. And that's when the first deer in the headlight comes. And then I get to finally asking, did you do everything in your power to make sure that they're succeeding at their job? And that's when you get kind of radio silence with them. And I think that's frustrating for the managers because oftentimes we'll send them back and saying, well, let's not start over, but let's go back a little bit with the beginning and make sure you did do those things to give employees everything they need to be successful. And I think that's where it starts with, is the more proactive you are in all of those things with your employees, the better it's going to be in terms of preventing employee relations.
Absolutely. You just talked about how important communication is too in this whole process. So can you share any tips for maintaining open lines of communication between employees and management?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. A couple of things come to mind. So when I work with managers, I would often say, I think you should spend at least once a month talking with their employees, which again, depending on their span of control, that might seem a little overburdensome for them or unrealistic.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it has to be a long conversation. Mainly I think it's just brief check-ins. How are you doing? Asking questions, personally about them. For example, how are your kids' soccer going? Or, what did you do this past weekend? Did you have some fun? Or what are your plans for the holiday? It's a little bit just getting to know them and showing you care.
Exactly.
Then it's building some other tips in, which is when you're talking with an employee, making sure that you're not making any assumptions about them or their stories or where they're coming from. Make sure that you're spending enough time to understand who they are and what might be going at home that could be affecting their job. Other things you can do is certainly, listen to understand. We hear about proactive listening and how important active listening is, but I truly believe, it's important to give someone your full attention when you're talking to them, looking at their verbals and nonverbals to see how comfortable they are with that conversation.
Right.
And I think another thing that's really important is choosing words carefully. I think it drives, managers that I speak with, and I say it's really important to role play. Think about that conversation in advance, and what words are you going to use? Because if you use the wrong word, it's going to make an employee defensive and make them shut down.
Right.
And then you lost all your credibility.
Exactly.
And then speaking of credibility, with employees, if you say you're going to do something, you need to do it.
Oh, yeah.
You need to follow through, and if you said you're going to look up something for them, make sure you look it up. If you say you're going to talk to someone else about something, make sure you talk to someone and then follow up and let them know, because that builds credibility. And then lastly, I think it's just being vulnerable, authentic, and humble. Showing them, that I've been in your shoes, I've made mistakes, and here's the mistakes I made, and this is how I learned from them, But being vulnerable with them really builds a lot of trust.
Yeah, those are all great tips and great reminders, too, for just creating that culture of positive employee relations. So we're closing out the episode now, but I want to thank you for being on the podcast today and really sharing your expertise on this topic. I know you deal with this every single day, so you're definitely an expert on it. But to our listeners, I would encourage you to like the episode, share it, leave a comment or review, and consider joining MRA if you aren't a member already. We've got all the resources in the show notes below, and we've got Amy's LinkedIn profile and her bio in there too if you want to get in contact with her. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in today, and thank you again, Amy, for all of your great knowledge.
Oh, thank you. It's been fun. I love it.
We'll see you next week. And that wraps up our content for this episode. Be sure to reference the show notes where you can sign up to connect for more podcast updates. Check out other MRA episodes on your favorite podcast platform. And as always, make sure to follow MRA's 30-Minute Thrive so you don't miss out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next Wednesday to carry on the HR conversation.